So our next speaker is Kathryn Kaminski. Kathryn is the Chief Research Strategist at Alpha Simplex Group and a specialist in systematic investing. She co-authored the book Trend Following with Managed Futures, The Search for Crisis Alpha. She has been a senior lecturer at MIT Sloan and visiting professor at the Swedish Royal Institute of Technology. Her work has been published in a range of industry publications as well as academic journals. In 2015, Kathryn was listed as one of the top 50 leading women in hedge funds. Kathryn holds a BS in electrical engineering from MIT and a PhD in operations research from MIT Sloan. So please welcome Kathryn.
Hi everyone, I'm so excited to be here today to talk to you about a really interesting topic, one that I think is very fun. It's not something that I'm doing on a day-to-day basis, but it's something that I think is really more about understanding the big picture of how our behavior and how we behave influences financial markets. So my topic today is adaptive markets and neurofinance. Just to give a little bit more context for this presentation, it was Wes.
Gus.
Right? Gus? Close.
Yeah.
I explained, I've taught at several different universities, and one of the topics I really enjoyed teaching the most was behavioral finance. And one of the cool things that I tried to incorporate in my behavioral finance class was neurofinance and adaptive markets. This is because I was a PhD student of Andrew Lo, who has written most of the work about adaptive markets. Who here is familiar with adaptive markets? Quite a few, so that's a good sign. Yay, that's really good. So what I wanted to do was kind of summarize some of the interesting things I've learned about that process. And let me just go through an overview of the three main areas I'm going to talk about today. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about how we behave and how our brain drives that behavior, and summarize some interesting facts from the field of neurofinance to give you a little taste of some of the things that they've been finding out. Then for that topic in particular, I really want to profile a book called Market Mind Games, which is really interesting, written by a neurofinance woman named Denise Schell, who is also a trading psychologist. So she actually works with traders to deal with how physiologically they handle trading, which is kind of a cool job, I think. And also in 2017, Andrew Lo published a synopsis of all of his work on adaptive markets, and it's been a bestseller. So those of you who haven't read it yet, definitely a good read for this year. Following that, after we talk about human behavior and the basics of neurofinance, I want to step back and ask the question, summarizing some of the literature also by Andrew Lo and some co-authors, trying to understand where did our behavior come from? Can we have some sort of understanding of what caused us to have this particular behaviors we have today? So why are we risk averse? Why do we choose certain things? Why do we do stupid things too? So are there any evolutionary origins that may help us to understand from a mathematical framework why we behave the way we do today? Then finally, I'm going to couple all of this in together and turn to the world of finance and talk a little bit about the adaptive markets hypothesis and how that can give us different ways to think about how finance works and some of the implications of this type of thinking about financial markets. Okay. So I'm going to start first by talking about human behavior. Now, just as a funny anecdote, I'm one of those people that has a father who's a clinical neurologist. So I grew up as a kid, and my father would make comments all the time to me about, oh, well, you're doing that because you have some passageway within your blah, 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 to your blah, 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 to your blah, 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 at the breakfast table. So I've always been very fascinated with human behavior and understanding why we do the things that we do. He would always say, the brain is a lazy brain. That's why you're using these rules and heuristics and these things, because you're just got to get the answer quickly. Okay, so let's kind of think about this for a second. So if you sit around and think about what drives human behavior or how we make decisions, well, the truth is it's a very complicated system. Human behavior is complex. It requires the integration of multiple systems to produce behavior. So that's a kind of a mouthful. So what I'm going to do instead is start by giving you all a test. So let's start with a simple test. Everybody ready? I didn't think you were signing up for a test, but here you go. I would like everyone in the room to say the color of each of these words. Let's do it together.
Red, green, blue, yellow, orange, blue, brown, red, green, purple, pink, black, blue, yellow, green.
A+. Good job. All right. Let's just do it again.
Blue, red, yellow, blue, orange, pink, red, brown, yellow, green, purple, black.
What's so hard about that? Did anyone have that moment where you felt like your brain just went like that? That's called cognitive dissonance. Conflict in reasoning. Remember, your brain is a complex system, and it turns out the part of your brain that processes verbal information is way more developed in modern humans than how you process color. So when you did that exercise, although it's very, very simple, the part of your brain that reads is so much more powerful that you had to cognitively reappraise it to get it to change what you said. That's why you had that moment where you saw that multiple systems in your brain were in conflict. Now, this particular situation is involved in pretty much any decision that we make. So we have multiple systems trying to interact. So how we handle fear, how we handle when the market tanks, how we handle when someone frightens us, all of these situations are involved in how we make decisions. So in that perspective, there's really no such thing as a rational or irrational, emotional or non-emotional behavior. They're all wrapped up together. Let me give you just another example of something similar. So let's take, the example I gave you was pretty simple, right? It was just verbal versus color. But in practice, strong emotional stimuli often override cognitive processing. So let me give a couple examples, and I think many of you, so there's some very intuitive reasons why this is the case. For example, emotional stimuli often trump cognitive processing. Why? Because survival is more important than some of these higher order effects, right? So for example, let's take a couple examples. Why is it the case that people that are normally very rational experience road rage? So the behavior is very good normally, but they get into a car, and emotional stimuli like road rage makes them behave completely differently. Take another example, and this goes back to, there's definitely a lot of students here in the audience. Did you ever go on a date and you felt like you couldn't speak? Any of you? I'm sure. Don't raise your hands. I'm not going to make you do that. The reason is, and you could have just stepped out afterwards, I'm sorry, I have my cognitive part for speech of my brain has now been overridden by my limbic brain. So it's actually true that your limbic brain has short-circuited your cognitive processing, which makes you unable to speak because of the emotional response. Another example, think about a forced smile. We all know what a forced smile is versus a natural smile. It turns out there's completely different muscles used in a natural smile versus a forced smile. So those mechanisms are all intertwined in that you can't make a fake smile unless you're trained to do it, like actors, where they have to induce an emotion to create their limbic brain to actually give them the emotion of smiling and happiness. Now I want to focus on one more fun anecdotal story, just because we're all mathematicians, or at least we like math if we're here. So there was a research study also in 2012 that talked about math anxiety. And they found that the anxiety comes before cognitive processing or analytic reasoning. So it turns out there may be lots of people out there that are quite good at math, but if you ask them to do a math test, because anxiety from the math precludes any activity in the brain to do math. So it's an interesting finding that shows us you could be quite mathematically skilled, but given a math test, you might flounder completely. So this tells us a little bit of something about how you can train individuals to be better at mathematics, for example. It has to do with how those systems are interacting with each other. So given these examples, we can really see that this whole concept of ignore your emotions doesn't really make sense. In fact, reason in any reasoning decision, any decision you make, includes emotions. All right, so what I wanted to do next, and this is just because we're kind of short on time, but I wanted to give you a few of the interesting summaries, findings in the neurofinance literature. Okay? So I'm going to start off with a couple of simple findings that are kind of interesting to know about. So in 2005, Cami Kunin and Brian Knudsen from Stanford were doing brain imaging on individuals, examining how they deal with risk and reward. Now, the interesting part of this study is they found that the brain processes gains differently than how they process losses. So it turns out that when you're processing a gain, you're activating a completely different portion of your brain than when you process a loss. In particular, they found that losses were associated with the same mechanism as disgust. So if you were to look at something like roadkill, for example, that's how you feel when you lose money in the markets. It's like looking at roadkill. And they showed that that is true. Okay? So I guess you could give yourself a break when you lose some money because you know that your brain is processing disgust, therefore it's normal. Anyways, so another thing that they found. Okay. That was a presentation thought there. That's good. Okay, another thing that they found, which was really interesting to me, was that they looked at, in a later study, they also looked at individuals, and they found a huge level of heterogeneity among people. So what that means is that some people, their brains really light up for reward, and some people, their brains go bananas about risk. And it turns out that those individuals, the same individuals, when they examined their financial statements and how they invested and how much they borrowed, it was very consistent with the decisions that they made. That suggests that we are in some sense hardwired for the behavioral and risk preferences that we take. And some of you may have this experience. I have this experience. I am hardwired for risk, which means it's good that I'm in risk management. But my husband is an entrepreneur. When we have a discussion, the first thing he says is opportunity. The first thing I says, but. Exact same conversation. His brain lights up about this, mine lights up about that. Same thing. So we're hardwired to react differently to those two situations. Now, another interesting study was John Coates from Cambridge. He was doing some studies on traders examining how hormones impact us. Now, what he found, and there was some discussion of this in the Financial Times, and it's a widely cited study for those of you that are familiar with it, but he found that testosterone was linked to performance in markets. So they examined traders' level of testosterone in the morning, and they could have some indication, or at least on average, a predictability of success during a trading day. So testosterone production is linked to confidence, and they also showed that higher level testosterone is actually over trading, over risk taking. So testosterone as a hormone is linked in terms of your reward system and your confidence. Cortisol, they also looked at the hormone cortisol, and they found that traders' cortisol levels were highly correlated to market volatility. So when the markets were up, the cortisol level in the traders were mirroring the market volatility. So it's an interesting point, the physiological response that you have on a daily basis to your P&L. Finally, and this is a fun one because for those of you in the audience that might be traders, in the trading psychology literature, it's become more common to examine heart rate variability. It turns out that high frequency heart rate variability is an indication of confidence. So the more experienced traders actually have higher heart rate variability. So what they can do as a trading psychologist is actually monitor this to examine how during the day in different situations you are physiologically reacting and how confident you are. So So if you're very confident, you'll have very high heart rate. Any of you who play sports might understand that. You know when you're in a tennis match and it's the heat of the moment and you have that sort of euphoric feeling that you're gonna win the points and you're in that moment? That's the same thing as what they're finding in trading. Okay, 2 more topics I wanted to cover here. This is kind of a fun one here. So besides sort of obvious things, there's also, have anyone read the book Gut Feelings? Somebody, okay, this is a good pro for a good book. There's a book that came out, and I always butcher the last name, called Gut Feelings in 2007. It comes from the Max Planck Institute by Gert is, I should have gotten it written down. But anyway, so the book is called Gut Feelings. It's very good. The idea would be that in very complex situations, that unconscious decision making can actually help you make better decisions than more analytic decisions. Okay? So the concept would be that gut feelings, your sort of intuitive ability to aggregate all that information, is actually performs better than some sort of descriptive strategy. Now I want to turn to one that I think is also quite fun. Visceral response. How you react to the temperature of the room, how you feel at a particular moment, the temperature of your coffee, etc. seems irrelevant, right? Well, 2 researchers, Lee and Schwartz, they decided they wanted to examine a common phrase called, have you ever heard of this comment, something smells fishy? I can't tell something's wrong. Well, they examined the smell of fish. And they found out that people who smell fish are 24% less likely to invest in subsequent periods. Who would have thought? Anyway, so this is a funny example of there's definitely things that are interacting with how you're thinking about decisions that will impact how you make decisions, even if you're not considering them. So even if they're unconscious. Okay, so the last area I wanted to talk about was social forces and how people interact with others. Because at the end of the day, each of us are part of a network of individuals participating in markets. Now, a couple quick summary of a couple interesting research findings. One, I just like this one. It's a good one. Those that have studied, they studied social rejection and physical pain. It turns out that the same mechanisms you follow the same mechanisms as when you experience physical pain. So actually, if you get dumped, you might take an apple. That's basically what it says. The same, you have the same mechanisms as if you had been in pain, if you have some sort of social pain. Then secondly, social context, we all know this. Social context can change how people decide how to make decisions. So this whole idea of groupthink. So people in a group will behave differently from time to time than as an individual. And the final, and this is probably the most relevant for this particular conference, to think about for all of us who are quants, Berger, Quartz, and Bohr, I'm bad with names, sorry, Bossarts, they were looking at brain imaging for individuals trying to forecast stock prices. And what they found, and this is something they didn't expect but was interesting to them, was they found that when they examined the performance of people who were trying to predict stock prices, the individuals who use theory of mind or understanding the future states of individuals and their mental states outperform at forecasting stock prices others. More interesting to them, they found that the area of the brain that is involved in probabilistic reasoning was not used. So essentially, understanding how others interact was a better predictor of stock prices for the individuals in a game than pure mathematics. So that's kind of an interesting thing for us to think about. Okay, so I wanted to finally summarize some of this with a quote that I think is a good summary of what I personally have learned from this literature. So contrary to the popular belief that feelings are generally bad for decision making, we found that individuals who experienced more intense feelings achieved higher decision making performance. Moreover, individuals were better able to identify and distinguish among their current feelings, achieved higher decision making performance via their ability to control the possible bias induced by those feelings. So let's summarize some of the takeaways for us in the quant world who are kind of getting into this area. what can we do? How can we learn from this literature in our day-to-day lives? Or at least these are some of the things I have learned. Number one, and this is funny to say this at a quant conference, but feelings and emotions are good for performance. Think about that quote. Please don't quote me on that. Like, no more invitations, right? No, I'm just kidding. Anyways, and then this is one that I find really interesting because I've done some public speaking over the years myself, and things like fear are something you have to manage when you're dealing with something new or new people. And in a particular study in 2012, this is a cool one. They found that most of us, when we're afraid, we do cognitive reappraisal. Don't be afraid. It's not scary. You're going to be fine. That's cognitive reappraisal, right? But they found that people who could articulate their emotion would actually have better performance. So actually acknowledging an emotion and saying really negative stuff, they even found as well, helped you to be more likely to be able to take over that bias. That was new to me, kind of cool. It's something to think about if you sit there and you go, gosh, I'm really worried about this thing, then it's something to think about. Finally, and this is just a quote, this is probably up here from my dad, but any of you guys remember Alda, right? So he was a famous actor that was on that show MASH. I was really young when the show was out. But he has a really new book out that came out that's kind of fun, and my dad actually has a little bit of a man crush on him. So I thought I would put this, he talks a little bit about this issue too, but he suggests that, actually let me tell you the title, just so you can kind of get why this isn't appropriate for us quants, right? If I understood you, would I have this look on my face? That's the title of his book. The point is working on learning to communicate with others. So what he says in his book, he talks about tricks for practicing relating, improvisation, and thinking about how using that concept of mirroring others can help you to be more effective in how you handle emotional situations. Okay. So given that, I want to turn now to evolution and the origin of behavior. So we talked a little bit about how the brain processes behavior. We talked a little bit about some of the interesting findings that's coming out in that new field of neurofinance. Now I want to go to evolution and discuss a little bit of intuition about what drives the behaviors that we have today. We can look at what behaviors we have, but why do they exist? And what makes those behaviors dominant in our current market ecology? Okay, so we all know that there's certain behaviors out there that economists would call irrational. In fact, perhaps crazy. So these are obviously some, taking a picture of a bull when you're about 3 feet away from it, not a good idea. Other sports, fun stuff. So the question is, if these things are so irrational, these behaviors, why do they still persist? Why do we see people do stupid things? There must be some reason for this. Classical economic theories don't explain them. Let me give some intuition. I'm going to start with an example. Okay? And that's why we have the whole field of behavioral finance, to try and understand it. So let's start with a simple example. Imagine that you have a coin, and the coin is biased. It has 75% chance of giving you heads and 25% chance of giving you tails. If you get the right head or tails, you get $1. If you lose $1. Now, what would you choose? Who here chooses heads? Anyone want to choose tails? Okay. So the profit maximization strategy would be to always choose heads. It's pretty obvious, right? We're all mathematicians here, right? Pretty much. So what's the probability? Well, the outcome is much higher. Choose heads, because it's a biased coin. But it turns out, when you ask people this question once, they say heads. But if you ask them a ton of times, they do this. Heads, 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 oh, what the heck. Tails, heads, 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 oh, what the heck. Tails. What kind of idiots are doing that? We all do it. That's the funny part. This is called probability matching. So it turns out that we will match the probability frequency of the arrival of that particular event. So instead of picking one forever, because that's too boring, why would we do that? We just start gambling sometimes. And we will match the probability of that arrival. Now, I'm going to turn this to another example and extend it, okay? And explain, using an example, some of the theories behind origins of behavior. So let's take this example and go a little bit more complicated here. So consider that I'm a bird, okay? Or you're a bird, or there is a bird, whatever you want. So this particular bird has to make a decision. Either I have a nest in the valley, or I have a nest on top of the mountain. If it's a sunny year, if I'm in the valley, I'm going to end up having 3 offspring. If it rains, I'm going to end up with nothing. Okay? If I was on top of the mountain, if it's a sunny year, I'm going to run out of any water, so I'm going to perish. But if it's a rainy year, everybody in the valley is going to perish, but I'm going to be the one that's living up there with 3 eggs. Now, if we take this and consider what would the bird choose? If the bird chooses to live in the valley, the expected value for the bird is 75% chance there's going to be rain sun times 3. Just to clarify, sun happens 75% of the time, rain happens every 4 years. Okay? Now, if that's the case, if I choose the valley, my expected number of offspring is 3 times 75% plus 0 times 25%, or 2.25. The mountain is 0 times 0.725 and 3 times 0.25. So clearly, if you're not a dumb bird, what would you do? Go to the valley. So everybody in the whole ecology is going to go to the valley. So all the birds in the world are going to live in the valley. That sounds kind of strange, right? Instead, consider the situation that the bird decides to develop a behavior. The behavior is to determine a frequency to go to the valley versus the mountain. So they toss a coin. If they have an unbiased coin, it'd be 50-50, like 1 year valley, next year mountain. This particular frequency we'll call F. So every year the bird says, with probability F, I'm going to go here. With probability 1 minus F, I'm going to go here. So let me take an analogy. Many of you probably drink coffee, right? How many people here like Starbucks better than Dunkin' Donuts? Okay, how many like Dunkin' Donuts better than Starbucks? A couple. But do many of you go to both, right? You may go to both. So you have some frequency, which is like a biased coin of your behavior of how often you go to Starbucks, and some frequency that you go to Dunkin' Donuts. But you lay in some range between 1 and 0. But some of you are staunch 1s or 0s, right? That's your behavior, how often you choose one or the other. So if we take this example, if F equals 1, what we see is that's going to the valley, the number of birds is going to get really, really, really fast, really, really big, and things are going to be great until there's a flood, and then they're all dead. Same thing is true up here. I didn't even show the 0. So until there's a flood, then they all die. But instead, if the population of birds decides to randomize their choice at some frequency F between the valley and the mountain, we have some that are dying in different periods, right? So for the entire population of birds, it's better. So if you're adapting, I'll explain. Actually, I'm going to explain it more this way. So this is all explained in some papers by Andrew Lowe. But here's the point. In a given population, there are behaviors that are population optimal, but individual suboptimal. So it means that we have behaviors that develop, like risk aversion and other behaviors like probability matching, which is better for the whole group of birds, but maybe for that bird that dies on the mountain, not so good. Exactly, and I'm sure that you can take the analogy to human behavior. what this particular mathematical framework suggests is that these behavioral biases that we have exist for a reason. These behaviors may be the foundations of what helps our ecology to survive, whereas as individuals it could be very difficult from time to time if we have these biases. So their particular models, they explain things like probability matching, randomization, risk aversion, loss aversion, and there's tons of math in these for those of you who want to go back and read about it. So then what Brennan and Lowe did, they then extended this model to concepts of bounded rationality and intelligence. So I'm just going to explain this in intuitive terms, and of course you can read these papers on your own if you want to hear more. So the point is this is consistent more with how people actually make decisions. Those of you familiar with Herbert Simon's concept of satisficing, the idea that we don't optimize but we satisfy constraints, so we kind of sort of get around to the right solution. So in this particular work, let me explain this more conceptually. So with their model, they can then explain that you can have diverse populations of agents or participants in finance terms where they can end up with varying levels of behavior and intelligence. So this seems sort of similar to how we think about the world. And in this type of model framework, intelligence and learning will dominate. The environment that you're in currently, think about the rain or the mountain, will impact the distribution of who succeeds. And finally, a diverse set of behaviors can all be successful in the same ecology. So you can have several species of market participants all coexisting in the same ecology. The exciting part about this work is it's the mathematical basis for the theory of the adaptive markets hypothesis. So given this, I just wanted to give a little intro to that, and now I'm going to turn to the adaptive markets hypothesis and talk more about what does this mean for financial markets. So the adaptive markets hypothesis is a body of work done by Professor Andrew Lowe from MIT, and he postulates that we can think about financial markets in a different way. Instead, we can think about them more from an evolutionary perspective. So it's about thinking about how markets evolve, how opportunities occur, and how market players succeed or fail based on principles in evolutionary biology. Now, most of the models that we think about finance are more physics-oriented. They're more about efficiency. They're more about more precise definitions, whereas this is more about thinking about how competition, reproduction, mutation, and adaptation across the market ecosystem drives who succeeds and fails. So let me just take a quote that I like from one of the original papers. Prices reflect as much information as dictated by the combination of environmental conditions and the number and nature of species in the economy or market ecology. Species are defined as distinct groups of market participants, including pension funds, retail investors, hedge funds, etc. So let's take an example here. So if we think about the hedge fund industry as a whole, it is a very competitive industry, and what we see is that the waxing and waning of these hedge fund styles, who's doing well and who's not, is really very much similar to a good example of how markets are more like an ecosystem, where when there's lots of opportunities, people go and capture them, competition increases, that makes things difficult. Those that can adapt and deal with it continue to compete. Those that can't go extinct. This is definitely the case in the hedge fund world, for those of you that are from that space. You're seeing always a waxing and waning of who's winning, who's getting those opportunities over time. Okay, so in an adaptive markets world, who wins? In an adaptive markets world, it's the people that apply the best heuristics, or if you want to go back to the word behaviors, I like the word heuristics for this, investment heuristics that continue to adapt, to succeed, and outperform others over a long time. So this is a quote from Andrew's paper from 2006 in HBR, just the survival of the richest. And some people laugh at me and say, come on, Katie, this is ridiculous. This is like Darwinism. And I said, exactly. So there are certain heuristics that work really well. And then there's other heuristics that don't work as well. Or they may work, but I don't suggest them. Okay. Anyways. So let me give an example by what I mean of investment heuristics. Human beings do not optimize. Although I love optimization, it's such a great process. When we actually make decisions and how we decide what we're going to do on a day-to-day basis, we apply heuristics. These heuristics are complex decision-making processes that we apply on a day-to-day basis, and we adapt them as we gain experience and we learn. And you can think about yourself. The way that you deal with issues and how you handle decisions has changed from when you were younger based on what you've learned. So this includes, of course, financial decisions. So I want to show you a simple thought experiment to think about this. So examine a wardrobe. You have 10 pairs of pants, 17 shirts, 8 belts, 13 ties, 14 jackets, and 10 pairs of socks. If this is the case, you have about 2.5 million different outfits in your closet. And I bet some of you have a lot more than that. At 1 second per outfit, it would take you 29 days to determine the optimal outfit for today. How did you get here today? How did you decide to get dressed? It's a very complicated problem. The point is, we all develop heuristics for answering those problems. And like my dad said, the brain is lazy. We find ways to solve those problems somewhat. We satisfy them. And we develop those heuristics over time as we experience and as we learn. So for example, you may have someone that comes in and says, oh, don't wear that again. Right? That's part of your experience set. So some of us have better heuristics than others, as an example. Okay, let me just summarize a few of the postulates of the adaptive markets hypothesis that we're about 5 more minutes here. So in an adaptive markets hypothesis world, we have some key paradigms. 1, individuals act mainly in their own self-interest. 2, individuals make mistakes. They satisfy instead of optimize. 3, they learn and adapt by applying heuristics in the way that they make decisions. 4, competition drives adaptation and innovation. So it's being competitive that drives us to become better. And 5, evolution determines market dynamics. So some of the practical implications, and this is highlighted in Andrew's paper in 2012. Number 1, alpha will eventually become beta. So ideas that are very unique will eventually become novel, which will then eventually become popular, which will eventually become common. Second, and this makes sense from the examples I talked about, the risk-reward trade-off is not stationary. In certain market environments, the risk profiles are different. So we do not necessarily live in a stable risk-reward trade-off world. There are environments where things can be very, very risky or very unrisky, but not stable. This leads into the point that occasionally we will experience something that Andrew would call a punctured equilibrium. A moment where you have things change in such a drastic way that it's part of the actual recalibration of the ecology for that to happen. So 2008 is a great example of this. That really punctured our industry, and we had to readapt and readjust to figure out how to survive in that type of environment. And finally, adaptive investment approaches will help you to improve your survival. So thinking about how you can adapt to different scenarios can help you survive. So just to summarize today's talk, only in 2 minutes here, we started off, we talked about human behavior. We talked about how human behavior is complex. We talked about how rationality is contextual. We then discussed some of the exciting new findings in the area of neurofinance and how this helps us to understand the role of things that we may not think about, especially for quants. We then discussed how evolution plays a role in where our behavior comes from and motivates why certain biases and behaviors exist. Remember this concept of globally optimal versus population optimal versus individual optimal. And finally, the adaptive markets hypothesis brings all of this together so that we can understand markets in a new way, where in that world, competition and innovation is key to success, And understanding how to adapt in your investment process is also important. So given that, I'm going to say thank you. And I definitely suggest anybody who's interested read Andrew's book. And I also put my book here for those of you like trend following. It's a little bit more specific. But I definitely suggest if you want to read more about some of these type of topics, Andrew's book is really sort of a home run for this to give you some new thinking about markets. Humans design the algorithms that do these things. So in some sense, it's just changing the composition of the players. So from that perspective, that change is just a structural change in the ecology and what we have to deal with today. And that's why, for example, some things that might have worked in the past don't work today. Because this new composition of the market and the way that people are interacting is different than in the past. So different things will be successful than what you might have applied previously. So it's just a new way of thinking. It's just a different ecology. That's what I'd say. I think the application in that section is not really about finding an optimal solution. The contribution of this origin of behavior thing that, just to give you the short end of this, for me what was really cool about the origin of behavior research was that instead of thinking about it as optimizing a decision, you think about a behavior as a decision that you choose at random, right? And we don't tend to think about behavior that way. We tend to think about behavior as one decision, when it's actually a sequence of decisions over time. So in the work of origin behavior, it's more trying to create a framework which can explain that in that type of system, certain smarter algorithms can beat others in certain environments. And it's more sort of a conceptual thing than trying to apply it. Applications are a little bit harder, but they're getting better. That's what I would say for myself, who first heard about the adaptive market hypothesis 15 years ago. I'm really seeing a lot more sort of ways to think about it going forward. So I think there will be more concrete examples in time. But that may be a good research project to do. Yeah. Exactly. I'm sure, actually I do see that people try and use this for intuition. So myself, I've used this type of way of thinking about markets when I think about trend following. And a lot of my research in the past was about thinking about, so when I think about a strategy like trend following, I try to imagine how is this strategy interacting with the other strategies to give me some intuition of why it might be competitive in one market or another. And that gives me more of a sort of, it's the market ecology that drives who wins and succeeds that helps to understand when one strategy may work over another. That's an example of how I think about that. I think that the work that Denise does is really cool, and it's interesting because it gets you to think about how much of all this emotion is involved in those decisions. And in her book, she goes through several case studies of actual investment traders and hedge fund managers, and they wanting to understand, how do I get better? Or something has changed in my performance. What is it that is causing me not be able to take risk anymore? So I think it's more that, can you open up your mind to think about how that emotional process can be managed or understood? Think about the market ecology. Let's just make it practical here. All the people are market participants. They're all holding long equities. They all have euphoria. Why? Because they've had so many gains that they think that they're invincible. And there's all these cycles of testosterone and overconfidence. And then what happens? The flood happens. People panic. Panic ensues, risk aversion goes, people are disgusted, etc. So yeah, so you can use this kind of thinking to help kind of put a different frame on market. That's a good example, good question. Well, think about it this way. If the market is an ecology where there's multiple people with different skills competing, some of them are using human intuition and theory of mind. Some of them are using quantitative algorithms like what I do to say, oh, the price went up, so I'm going to sell. Oh, the price went down, so I'm going to sell. In certain environments, that works better for one or the other. And over time, those that have good enough heuristics or rules to work in enough environments, they'll survive. They'll stay alive. And then there'll be certain environments that are terrible. Let me give you an example for trend following. I think we're running out of time, but take what happened to oil in 2014. Oil just tanked. And all of the macro traders out there, they could not trade it because emotionally, they just couldn't believe that that would actually happen. Whereas the systematic traders, because they didn't have that feeling, they were actually able to short. So that market environment where there was so much uncertainty and the world was changing was a good one for that behavior, the systematic trading behavior. And I can turn it around to February when a systematic strategy says, equities are up, I'm going to buy them. Whereas a discretionary trader might go, people are crazy. What's going on here? I'm getting out, and try to get out before. So each environment is about us competing for those resources and the risk and reward of them. And sometimes some people win, and other times others do. And the goal of us, all of us, is to find a good enough strategy that we don't go extinct. Exactly. Okay, good question.